Hello, students. Welcome to our chapter on memory. As we get started, please think of something that you have a hard time remembering or something that you wish you were better at remembering. And while you do that, before we really get into this, also think of a couple strong memories you have. Let's make them positive memories for this class because we'll come back to these examples a lot of times. So write down in your notes a couple pretty strong positive memories. This can be something recent, like within the last year, but maybe think of something also that's maybe 10 years ago or more. So we'll be talking about memory, and so calling on these examples, and hopefully it'll help you make connections. So how do our brains make memories? Mainly, it's because of the same physical process that we've been talking about this whole time. It's the connections between neurons all across our brain. Those neural networks are our memories. And we'll talk about how that happens. I've alluded to it in other times in the class, but we'll talk about it in a lot more detail today. So it really comes down to this, to these brain networks. So here we see a lot of neurons and as well as supporting cells. Here we see a lot of neurons all connected together. So here we've probably got some, I don't remember exactly what pieces this was. This might have been some gray matter and white matter. I think this might all be gray matter actually. But we're also talking about the synapse. So neurotransmitters get spit out from the neuron 1 over to neuron 2, activate some of these receptor sites and let that signal pass. And so basically all of this that we're going to be talking about comes down to that biochemical and physical process. So with that in mind, let's watch a quick video of neurons reaching out to make connections to give you some idea of what this kind of looks like in the brain, how this happens. I believe this video is actually done in a petri dish, so it's gonna look a little bit different in your brain, but this will give you some idea of that process of neurons reaching out with axon branches, with making new dendrites to make more connections. And it can happen pretty quickly. So as this is playing, pay attention to the hours in the bottom right corner of the video. So again, this is only a couple neurons in a petri dish, but you can see these axon branches or dendrites. I can't tell from this video and its resolution which they are. Remember, we have one axon, but it does break into different branches at the end of the axon where it's not myelinated anymore. And then we've also got dendrites that can grow as well and receive messages. So if you see these little kind of brighter points, that is some of it growing and trying to reach out and then making connections. But hopefully that gives you some idea of what it actually looks like and how quickly that can happen. A lot of these new connections are reaching out to make new connections early on in life. Even when we are adults, this process still happens. We can still make new connections this way. A lot of connections also happen by strengthening already existing connections. So here, there might already be a connection between, let's say, these two neurons, and it can be strengthened with this process. So there are some certain neurotransmitters that are involved in memory. Again, they're involved in a lot of things, not only memory, but here is a whole big list of the different kind of neurotransmitters that are specifically involved in memory. So epinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, acetylcholine, all of these are involved in the process of a brain network making a memory. So a lot of this is down to here at the synapse becoming the cells itself learning and knowing, hey, I get activated regularly. I'm going to take less energy to activate later on. Basically, their physical and chemical makeup inside, they change their pattern so that they fire a little more easily. That's one of the things that strengthens this network. So the other thing is actually making new connections. So with this, you have neurotransmitters that will activate, right? So you'll have one neuron spit neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. With that, those increased neurotransmitters in that synapse lead to stronger connections, right? So you have these next cells maybe make some more receptors or take less energy to activate because it's being used regularly. And that's really what memory consolidation is. And we'll talk about that. Hopefully, you've read it in your book already, but we'll talk about that in a little more detail later on in the lecture. That's essentially the solidifying or the storage of the memory, putting it into your mental hard drive to make it a long-term memory. So that a lot of that is down to this strengthening of connections, making it easier for these cells to do their job to recall this memory, to put that memory into your brain as well. So with this, memories are composed of specific sets of neuron circuits, so a whole big network. It seems like for humans, they're probably in groups of around 1,000 neurons. It might be more, might be a little less. But we also see that single neurons also play a role. Some single cells respond to certain things. We'll talk about some place cells in a little bit, but also we have seen single cells respond to things like faces or respond to specific colors. So it's like this neuron is the hair color, like the brown hair color. It activates when you see brown hair color. So there's a complex network. It's not just a couple neurons. It's a pretty big network of neural connections for any given memory. We do see that we have like identifying pieces, things that are facial detectors, and that's something that we probably evolved a capacity for to detect faces because socio-emotional interaction is so important for humans. So whether I'm doing a frown or a smile, that you might take my message different. So it seems like we have certain cells that sometimes activate with a certain input, but they're still in that group. It's not just that one cell's job for a whole memory or trying to interact. It's a piece of that whole big 1,000+ neuron puzzle. So when two neurons get activated at the same time, they might form a connection. They might start reaching out, and then because they're both being activated at the same time, they might connect up and become part of a network. So essentially, these connections for things like habits or memories specifically today is what makes those kind of well-established paths or highways. So it makes a network for a given memory. So the brain essentially remembers by recreating and reactivating that same pattern of neurons. So those, let's say it's 1,200, are your memories of your first kiss, let's say. So next time you remember that first kiss, you are activating those 1,200. Now, during the event, you probably had more, but we'll more neurons than just those 1,200 activated, but we'll talk about that. Because how do neurons know to become a memory? Well, they don't have their own little brains, right? These are just cells. Neurons are just simply cells. They have a specific function and they try to live and survive. They're using energy, they're putting out waste, and they're sending signals. But they don't know, they don't have a conscious brain, right? There's no inside out characters inside any given neuron that are saying, hey, that's important. That should become a memory. So, how do they know to become a memory? This is a whole field of biopsychology and neurobiology that's been looked at for a long time. A lot of people have searched for an engram. Originally, it was kind of thought that maybe there were specific neurons that were part of like one memory and you kind of wrote it and maybe memory was stored in a specific place. So that's kind of what the word engram is. It's like, where is the physical structure of a memory? So now, with the better methods that we have, things like helping rat cells glow when they're active and things like that, all the different methods that we've talked about in class has let us see that engrams are in a big network around the brain. So essentially, all cells have active and inactive cycles. For neurons, it's about 12 hours, so they go into like high activity for 6 hours and then into low activity for 6 hours. So higher activity 6 hours, lower activity for 6 hours. So with that, not all neurons are at that highly active place at the same time, right? Maybe you've got three neurons next to each other. Maybe this one, let's make sure my camera's picking up. So let's say this one is on its low activity. This one is on its super high activity, and this one is kind of in the middle. right? So the most active neuron, this one here in the middle, that's in its peak of high activity, that one will become part of the memory. Even if all three of these are part of the experience you have, only the one that is the most active will become that memory. So engram cells decrease the activity of nearby neurons as well when it is replaying that memory. We'll talk about this as we go along, but one way that memories become strengthened is your brain basically replays that memory. So oftentimes this is happening when you're in deep sleep. Your brain kind of reruns you could think of it as a network program for a memory. So it's like rerun that memory, reactivate all those cells together. And the hippocampus is basically directing that process. So this neuron, the one that was the most highly active, tells these ones, hey, don't activate. You're not needed for this. I'm part of this network. You're not, because it was the most active during that time. So those most active neurons know to become the memory. And that's just because they are the most active. They're doing the most job. They're putting the most neurotransmitters out, right? That's kind of how the biology works with it. Those most active neurons become an engram. So let's watch a little video of this. So any engram cell is the specific neurons that were the most active as a result of the experience. So you had your first kiss, you had, let's say, for example, during your first kiss, you had not just 1,000 neurons, but let's say you had 10,000 neurons that were active during that time. Well, it's not all those 10,000 that become the memory, it's those about 1,000 that were the most active at the time become that memory. So later on, when you try to remember that event, it will trigger those original neurons that were the most active during that time. So the engram, where it is physically, is those neurons. And that's going to be obviously for something like that. For a first kiss, you're probably using the emotion center of your brain. You probably have sensation centers of your brain, right? You might be hearing music. You might have your eyes open for some of it and then closed for some of it, right? So you might have visual pieces of that. So you're going to have multiple brain networks active at the same time. And so a part of those neurons become the memory. So let's watch this little video. Hopefully it explains it in a way, if you're not understanding from me, you'll understand it from this. Oh, and this image is essentially from a paper about engrams, saying that they are either high or low activity. Some of them become the memories, and then for memory consolidation, they keep networking together. Then when you retrieve them, you're activating that same network. So here's all of the active neurons. You see these ones are the most active with the big arrows. So they start to become the memory while you're consolidating it, while you're learning it. Your hippocampus says, hey, run that network. And then now it's the memory. So when you retrieve it, you are activating those same neurons.
Not that literal, but thanks to advances in neuroscience, we can finally pinpoint the actual location of a memory, at least if you're a mouse. To find a memory, first you have to make one. And it's easy to do that. You just do something. Anything, just like, watch me do this. That's in your brain now. You're stuck with it. Your brain will then pick a bunch of cells to store a memory of the thing you just experienced, and it will activate them all at the same time. But those cells aren't all in the same place because the parts in your brain specialize in different things. Your brain will pick cells across regions to store all the different aspects of a memory. For example, neurons in the visual cortex will store what you were seeing, and the cells in your amygdala will store how you were feeling. That specific pattern of cells all firing together is what the memory is now, in all of its multisensory glory. The word scientists use to talk about this physical trace of a memory in a brain, the pattern of cells that activate to recall a memory, is an engram. It's the unique pattern of cells activating together across the brain that makes a memory. And these cells are actually changed by the learning experience. They form stronger connections with each other than with other neurons, and they develop more dendritic spines, protrusions that help neurons talk to each other. So, how do you find an engram? Ideally, if you could watch neurons fire, you should see the same ones fire when the same memory is activated, and we can do that in mice. In a 2007 study published in the journal Science, researchers taught a mouse to associate a mild foot shock with a sound. This is a pretty commonly used protocol for studying memory. If you see the mouse tense up, you know it remembers a shock is coming. And don't worry, it's like a little zap. The researchers used a special glowing protein to tag the neurons that fired as the mouse learned. That let them monitor what neurons fired when the mouse heard the tone and remembered what was coming next. A few days later, when the researchers played the sound again, they saw the same neurons firing. Basically, they saw that memory. Now, the next question was whether altering the neurons in the engram.
All right, the rest of this video is pretty great, but we will stop it there. So feel free to watch the rest of that video. It is a really good one, but hopefully this gives you a couple different examples of that memory. So think about your own memory, the happy memories I told you to try and remember. Which parts of your brain do you think are active when you are remembering that memory? What pieces of the brain network are you getting? Are you getting a lot of visual? Are you getting a lot of touch? Are you getting a lot of emotion? Are you getting a lot of like prefrontal cortex and like really thinking about this kind of thing? So what brain areas are that memory in? So another way you can think of this, if you've done any like video or audio or like photo work, oftentimes you will have a compressed file. So there's raw files versus compressed files. So a JPEG is not the full picture of what a camera takes, right? So a camera will take, let's say, a 21 megapixel photo. So you've got so many pixels in that photo, but when you upload it to, say, Instagram, it's not going to necessarily upload, depending on your settings, that full file. Usually what you will upload is a smaller file. So what it's doing is it's taking all of those pixels and it's saying, okay, these ones are close enough, or all of these are the same. So rather than remembering all 6 of these individual pixels are green, we're going to remember this cluster over here was green. And these ones over here, there's one over there that's a little bit different colored, but we'll just call all of this like a shade of red. And so it compresses it. It takes all of the tons of thousands of pixels and it compresses it into a smaller number of pixels. That's good enough for our human eyes and for our screens to put out and things like that. So we do that with audio as well. An MP4 file is a more compressed version of the file. If you've ever downloaded it and compared it to something like a WAV file or a FLAC file or a RAW file, you can see the number of bits, the size of it is smaller. So this is to say, if you didn't understand any of that example, totally fine, just ignore it. Essentially, that's what a memory is. A memory is a compression of the event. So you had the 10,000 neurons active during an event, during your first kiss, the first time you did a cool skateboard trick, whatever it might be, right? You had 10,000 active during that time, and about 1,000 of those are going to be the actual memory. So it's not all of them. It's a smaller subsection, and those are the neurons that were the most active at the time. They make stronger connections with each other, both through the growth of dendrites and axon branches, but also because their synapses are better at talking with each other, more efficient. So about what it looks like for humans and other mammals, looks like it's about 10%, maybe a little less than 10%, so somewhere around like 7-8% of the neurons in any given experience become the memory. Again, that's about the 10% most active neurons. And that's a whole bunch of areas of your brain. So these are, again, I think we've seen this image before, but this is the axons all throughout your brain, or a bunch of the axons throughout your brain. So you've got things in your prefrontal cortex. The hippocampus is really important for starting to make that memory. You've got your occipital lobe, your sensory inputs up here, all sorts of areas, your amygdala somewhere down here. So there is a lot of things happening in your brain. And so you're taking all those neurons that are active and you're using about 10% of them to become a memory. So your memory of that first kiss versus that skateboard trick, you might be using a few of the same actual neurons in both those networks, right? There might be a neuron that is in the amygdala that is a joy neuron, like, right? It's active when you're feeling joy. It's sending joy throughout your brain. That neuron might be part of more than one memory network, right? But it's the networking of those neurons that is that memory. So when you remember a memory, you're activating some of the same neurons that were active during the event. You could say you're kind of replaying that for your brain. You're reliving that event from that memory. But this also leads us to things like, well, you can alter or change memories in certain ways to certain extents because those networks can have things added to them or taken away from them. So if you think of a memory 15 years ago, it might not be as crystal clear as one maybe a couple months ago. Right? And there might be pieces that you're like, oh, that camping trip I took with my family when I was, I don't know, 12 or something. Was that this year or was that that year? Or are you putting two together? That's an example of a memory, some memories that I have combined. So they're clearly not super crystal clear. It's not the nice little video memory balls from Inside Out. So over the course of like two different summers, and it was like the two summers right next to each other. I think I was like 12 or 13. It might have been 14 or 15. Not the point though. So when I was younger, my family took us on two cross-country road trips. So we basically went across the country and did like national parks one year, and then another year we did like U.S. history sites. So in my mind, my memories, those are the exact same trip. And it makes sense because I was in the same exact car, in the same exact seat, playing the same exact video games on the Game Boy as we were driving. And then we went to really similar types of campgrounds. While one trip was campgrounds and hikes and things like that, the other trip was going to things like museums, like Smithsonian museums. I saw the Liberty Bell, things like this, right? So in my mind, in my memories, that was the same trip. It was one single trip because there's enough of the same neurons that over time my brain's just like, yeah, activate it all together because there were already enough of the same neurons in that. And that's the case. Memories are a little bit fallible because of this physical process. That being said, we can't come up with completely false memories that could not have happened. So my brain is not going to remember that I saw a living dinosaur on that trip, right? Because that's so far out of the realm of reality of the networks and the experiences that I have that that is not, I can't make that memory. I could probably make a memory of like, oh yeah, there was a robot dinosaur at one of the museums or something like that. But I'm not going to make a completely false memory that is so far out of actual reality. So pretty cool things about how the brain makes memories. A couple more specific neurons. I kind of alluded to these place cells a minute ago. They're called place cells because they are specific cells in the hippocampus that when we study rats, and it looks like we have these in humans as well, there are specific individual neurons that will fire for a specific location. So this is done with rats when they are going around a maze, and this rat is traveling around, and we see this purple neuron is one single neuron. So it's activating when the rat is in this area. And then as it gets to this area, this yellow one starts to activate. And then this kind of greenish, tealish, palish, seafoam greenish one starts to activate. And then this bright green one, and then this red one, and then this blue one, and then this orange one. And really these dots are just colored to like indicate to us looking at this picture when the different neurons. But each of these purple dots is one time that that neuron fired when the mouse was going along in this path. So the mouse or the rat, yeah, this was rats, are kind of meandering along, and that purple one is firing, then the yellow one is firing more than the blue one, but there's a little bit of overlap. So these are specific individual neurons that are part of the memory for the location of the maze that it was in. And one another thing that they saw was that these neuron paths were strengthened for better reactivation during sleep, the connections between them. So this yellow and seafoam green one are probably a lot more connected than the seafoam green and this yellow one. So these are specific neurons that remember, that help you remember this place. That's why they're called place cells, and humans have this too in our hippocampus. So humans have mental maps and place cell neurons too. It's similar to other engrams in the brain, but these are really specific for like location that you're at. And there might be other similar neurons across your brain that kind of do this. Another thing that our brains do is called grid cells. Essentially, these are clusters of cells that work to fire together to understand your place in the world. So they understand you're about this far away from these things. Even if the lights are off, even if you only get a little bit of sensory information, they help us to see where we are in three-dimensional space. So it's like those place cells, but it's clusters of neurons that kind of work together to give you the perception of where you are. So if you're trying to wander around the room at night and not like wake up your partner and get to the bathroom or get your slippers or whatever it might be, these grid cells are going to take whatever inputs you have and help you understand where you are in the space. So this is a little visual example, and this is part of this video that I will watch part of with you. So essentially, this rat, when it is here in this location, its cell number 6 is firing. But not only that, that same location is also part of cell number like 12 and cell number 4. And the overlap helps it to know exactly where it is. So we're not going to watch this whole video. The whole video is 15 minutes, but I want to give you just a little bit of example of how these cells work together to fire. But the main idea is very similar to the place cells. It's a network of cells, specifically in our hippocampus, that activate to help us navigate through three-dimensional environments.
Okay, so let's first look at a visualization of just one grid cell. So in this visualization, I've got my little mouse cursor, and I'm moving through a 2D space. As I move through the space, just like in the video from the experiment that we saw, sometimes a cell fires. So this is just one grid cell. Sometimes it fires as this mouse moves through this space. You can see it looks sort of random. In the bottom left corner here, I've got a representation of that grid cell. I'm going to show you all the places in the space that this cell fires as I hover over it. Here's this grid cell's firing field. It will fire when the mouse gets close to any one of these locations in this two-dimensional space. And as you can see, there are a lot of locations where it doesn't fire at all. The mouse just runs through and it never fires. So there's a couple problems with just having this one grid cell. One is that it's not always firing, and the other is that when it does fire, the grid cell isn't really telling you exactly where the mouse is, because when the mouse is in one of these locations, the grid cell fires. That means it could be in any one of these locations. So it's an ambiguous representation of space, so we don't really know where the mouse is. We just know it's in one of those locations, but not which one. So in order for grid cells to be useful, we have to have more than one of them at a time. So I'm going to show you what we refer to as a grid cell module, which is a group of grid cells that all project onto a space in the same way. So take a look at this. I've got this grid cell module that has 16 cells in it that sort of have this parallelogram shape and tile across this whole two-dimensional shape. So the grid cells themselves are not arranged in any way in the brain. They are tiled across a two-dimensional space in this example. So it's not like the grid cells are right by each other and they're retaining this shape. This is just how they represent space, this tiling, this parallelogram. So
I'm going to jump in really quickly because while I think that's a good explanation, some of the words you may not have understood. Essentially, in the brain, the cells that are the grid cells that are getting your place in space are not necessarily all next to each other. You might have grid cells kind of far apart from each other, but they're still activating when someone is in a specific area.
A bit larger. And you can see as we move and add another grid cell module, that ambiguity gets less and less, because as you add more modules, let's go ahead and add all 5 grid cell modules here. And now you can see, so I'm going to freeze this again right here where the mouse is and show you, okay, here's all of those grid cell modules have a firing field that's overlapping with every other grid cell module right here. So they all think the mouse could be here. This is the only place in the whole two-dimensional space that they all think the mouse might be.
So these are individual neurons that are networked together, and because they're all networked together and they're like, hey, you are in this area, that's how you can tell maybe you're on the right side of the bed or left side of the bed or this part of the living room or that part of the living room with very limited inputs. So even if it's, say, dark, these grid cells are working in your brain to give you a sense of area, right, where you are in 2 and 3-dimensional space. So then sometimes you might be a little unclear. Maybe some of the grid cells, you don't have enough input for them all to be active. But this network of a pink, green, blue, slightly different green, and kind of yellowy gold will give you a sense of, oh, I am here in my house. Maybe you kind of shuffling around and you like hit a rug or you touch a wall and you're like, oh, okay, yep, I remember where I am now. It kind of reorients and you have now an activation of a bunch of grid cells. So very similar to the place cells that activate in a specific place, but they're saying, oh, putting all this information together, we know we are here. So the main idea behind that grid cell is that it helps you see where you are in 3-dimensional space. But not only that, it seems like we use these grid cells to also help us visualize things. So if you try to imagine a skateboard in your mind, have, say, a floating visual skateboard in your mind, rotate it around. If you try to imagine the Liberty Bell, if you try to imagine the Statue of Liberty, right? If you look around this object, if you can kind of like mentally like fly around it, you are actually also activating grid cells. So they help us with a lot of things. And it does go to show that the way we network neurons is a little different than we might have previously thought. Different areas of our brains have different ways that they structure networks, but this is one way that we put things like place cells together and have grid cells together working to help us visualize things. So if you are imagining yourself in your bedroom, in the library, in the classroom, you are using some grid cells to kind of orient yourself and have an idea of, oh, I'm really far or I'm not that far from that wall, that kind of thing. So they do help us with more than just right now I'm sitting in my office, so I know there's a window over here, there's a door over there, there's another desk behind me over here. It helps with that, but it also helps. These are active when we are trying to visualize something. And it does seem, especially since it's from the hippocampus, that that is one of the reasons that visualizing things can really help people remember. And we'll talk in this lecture about some visualizing tricks and techniques and mnemonics to help you remember things. So grid cells are groups of neurons that we just call grid cells because they seem to represent kind of grids of our physical environment. So we can visualize them kind of in a grid pattern in the natural environment. So thinking about these processes, the processes of making connections, the processes of making new axon branches and dendrites, of neurons networking themselves together for a memory. So you've got those maybe 1,000 neurons, that's an engram for a memory, or some grid cells to kind of be able to help you visualize something. What are some other brain processes that we've learned about or that you can think about that might use similar methods? All right, so hopefully you write some things down in your notes. Feel free to pause the video, but also we will go on to make some connections. So if you're in an in-person version of this class or like a hybrid version, we will do this mnemonic activity in class, but I want to describe it really quickly in the lecture video. But I'm not actually going to go through the activity in the lecture video. If you're in an online or hybrid class, sometimes we do this as a group activity kind of thing or a hybrid activity kind of thing, fully online that you can do yourself. But mnemonics essentially are strategies to make more connections to help remember things. Because if you've got less than 1,000 neurons with a connection, then it's going to be harder to remember that memory. If you're making more than 1,000 neurons a memory, it's maybe a little easier to activate that memory. And that's the idea of mnemonics. It helps you remember things. So one that's really used very often is called the method of loci. I've also heard it called the method of loci or loci. So I've heard all of those. I've heard other PhDs use all of those terms, so it's one of them. I should probably ask someone who actually speaks Latin because that's where it came from. So another thing you might probably have heard this called is the journey method or the mind palace. So Sherlock Holmes in the like Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes like went into his mind palace and like visualized things. That's exactly what this is. So you could take some example words like bottle, cup, paper, these random words. Maybe this is a shopping list, maybe this is phone numbers, maybe this is facts that you need to remember, and you can connect it to things. I use this actually to try and remember shopping lists. So I would take a place that I know really well, some place you can visualize. So you're using some of those grid cells, some of those place cells, have a lot of networks for a place. The place that I remember the best is the house I lived in during high school. So it's not the most recent house I've lived in. I haven't actually been back there in, I don't want to do that math right now. But I remember it really clearly. So I would use that as the location because I can imagine myself moving through it. I can imagine the things that are there. Since it was high school, I imagine myself coming off the bus, coming up to the front door. Outside the front door is a bottle. I drank way too much Mountain Dew as a high schooler, so it's a bottle of Mountain Dew. So I'm making connections to things that are relevant to me. I'm helping this new memory of bottle be connected to networks that should already exist. So then I open the door. Inside the door, for some reason, on the ground is a cup. Right? So bottle, cup, I can imagine myself pouring a glass of Mountain Dew, right? And then as I walk into the house, there's a coffee table in the living room and there's a stack of paper on it. So that's how I can remember some of these things. I continue to walk through the house. I'm going past the back door. There's a bunch of sand on the ground in front of the back door. Maybe a sibling like came in from a sandbox and like dropped a bunch of sand. I continue walking into the house. There's a kitchen, and on the kitchen counter is a box. Amazon didn't exist when I was in high school, at least not in the same way. But to me, I'm going to imagine it's an Amazon box. That's a lot of the boxes I get currently. I'm making some connections. And that's the idea with any mnemonic. You are trying to make connections, things that are easy to remember, putting things that are hard to remember, and connecting it. So if you can connect it with emotion, if you can connect it with visuals, that is very helpful. So that's what a mnemonic is. So with this, there's a list of mnemonics here in the slides, or you can just go to Wikipedia, look up mnemonics. They're essentially just strategies to make connections and remember things. So think of other ways you could use mnemonics. They can be very, very useful tools. Here's another example of one that exists. So you can use your knuckles for the days of the year. So whether it's 31 or 29 for if the knuckle is going up or down. So shorter months are in between. So in that gap between your fingers, that's when the shorter months are. So that's a mnemonic you can use. It's just using other tricks. Mnemonics, you could call it a memory trick. So if you've tried any other mnemonics, that would be great to, say, share with your classmates, whether it's a discussion board or something like that. It would be fantastic to let us know what kind of mnemonics works for you. And that's the thing. Everybody's brain is a little bit different. Maybe you're not as good at visualizing. Maybe something else is more helpful for you. Maybe you're really good at numbers. So putting things together, connecting them with numbers. But a lot of humans are really good at visualizing for connecting to memories. So try some out, see which ones work for you. All right, so next we will talk about how we record and put that memory into the network of our brain. So we've got the basics of it. We know the neurons are a part of it, but let's talk about how we go through that process of making the memory exist there long term. So we'll talk about the brain areas specific to memory in just a minute. Most of what we're talking about right now has to do generally with what we've been talking about, the hippocampus right here in green, and then the rest of the brain cortex. So the main idea here is that as you're having an experience, you are activating those different areas of your brain. We've talked about those areas in other classes. So hopefully you have a good idea and sense of the different areas that do certain things. So prefrontal cortex, higher level thinking, cerebellum for balance, occipital lobe for vision, a lot of communication happening in the midbrain, emotion and amygdala. Before any given memory, you have the hippocampus and these cortical areas active at the same time. So that's what this image is trying to show. The hippocampus and those cortical areas are all active while that event is happening, while that first kiss is happening, while that cool skateboard trick is happening, while that memory of vacation is happening. Those are all active. So essentially what happens is that hippocampus, as you experience that event, what it does is after the event, when you're resting, when you're in deep sleep, it tells those neurons, those what becomes the engram, what becomes that set of neurons that were most active during the event, it says, hey, make some activations, reactivate, continue running that memory program, essentially. And so over time, you get to the point where just these cortical areas are what's needed for that memory. And the hippocampus might call on that memory or other things might trigger that memory, but that's now where the memory lives. Over time, it's partially the hippocampus and those cortical areas, but over time, it's just those outside cortical areas is where the memory will be stored. So to begin with, the hippocampus is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, directing the memory, integrating into different areas of the cortex that were active during the event. And over time, through those connections in the cortex becoming stronger, the memory becomes permanent and it's in the cortex and it relies less on the hippocampus for any memory direction because that memory is there now. So my memory of the trips I took, that is now one memory, like I mentioned, that's all in that cortical area and it's not really using much of the hippocampus as much as it was right at the beginning. So what are the pieces of that puzzle? Well, we've got encoding, storage, and retrieval. So encoding is the process of taking all the raw data, all the input, all the stimuli that you're experiencing, and processing the seemingly most important to create the memory. And so stress hormones and other related stress neurotransmitters are really helpful in determining what is important. Right, so something like a very emotional and stressful event or traumatic event, that is one of the reasons that they're so remembered because they're using some of those hormones, some of those stress hormones, right? But also the things that you're really engaged in, you are excited about, you're really intensely focused on this chess match or whatever it might be. You still have stress hormones there. So noradrenaline, norepinephrine are a big part of this puzzle, telling specific neurons that are getting some of that noradrenaline, norepinephrine that are the most active, that will later become that engram. Hey, this is important. Make it a memory. Right. So yesterday when I was driving home from work, I am sure I saw like birds flying over water or like the couple areas of the sound that I drove by, the Puget Sound. Um, but I can't remember that. I do remember when I couldn't really see and I was worried about pulling out into traffic, right? And I was really worried that maybe someone was coming and they was in like a blind spot on a pillar in my car. And so I was like, oh no, next time I need to adjust my car. So I remember that pretty clearly, but a lot of other things happened in that commute. I was commuting down to the Shelton campus. So it was a little bit further. So a lot of things happened, but only those things that gave me a little more stress were remembered as dramatically. So that is the encoding. You take the raw data using the neurotransmitters in your brain and your neurons know, hey, let's make this a memory. This seems more important than other things that are happening now. And then you go to the next step, which is consolidation or storage. And this is the process of that hippocampus saying, hey, reactivate neurons that were active during the event. Again, that about 10% of them that become the engram continue activating, make connections with each other. It's the hippocampus is directing that so that they become long-term storage. So you're transferring those short-term memories into long-term. The hippocampus is doing that job at first, but the rest of the neocortex, so the rest of the outside of the brain, is going to become the home of that memory. So you can kind of think if you watch Inside Out or you've ever seen that, there's different like background characters. So not the main emotions that we pretty much follow, but there's the people who are working in like long-term memory. We have people who like drive trains and things and move things around in the movie. So those background characters, I think of them as like living in the hippocampus. So the inside out characters are kind of like the amygdala. They are saying, this is important, send it back to memory. And so they kind of direct it, but the rest of that whole process of saying, hey, remember this memory, keep it strong, that's what the people in the background are doing. So, and I just remembered the triple dent gum or triple mint gum. I guess I need to watch Inside Out again to remember that. But that's the consolidation, the storage piece. Most consolidation is happening during stage 4 sleep, which is called deep sleep. So if you look at this little graph here, you go on average, people go pretty quickly once they're awake to stage 1, 2, and stage 2 is still a pretty light stage of sleep. Oftentimes, if you wake someone up in stage 2 sleep, they might even say that they're not sleeping, but that's a whole other topic on consciousness and things like that. Stage 1 sleeping, if you see someone in class that's like this and kind of drooping their head, they're probably already in stage 1 sleep. So it's a very light version of sleep. So it's not till we get down to stage 4 that the most of the consolidation happens. So your hippocampus is then directing those areas in the cortex. Oh, too far. Should have used arrow keys instead. So your hippocampus is directing those cortical areas to rerun that memory, rerun that program, strengthen your connections. So when you wake up, you'll have that memory a little more strongly stored. Most of us do our stage 4 sleep, our deepest sleep, early on in the night. So you can see this if you do like a Fitbit and track your sleep as well. You'll have deep sleep for kind of a big chunk, maybe 2 or 3 chunks at the beginning of the night, and then basically no deep sleep the rest of the night. And that's pretty common. This is a pretty common average pattern for any given person. The stage 3, maybe you jump a little bit into stage 4. And then REM sleep is actually a pretty light form of sleep. So that random eye movement. Oftentimes we remember dreams when they're happening in REM. And it seems from research that we probably still do have dreams in these areas, but it's a lot harder to remember them. Your brain is doing a lot of different processes. It's doing these kinds of processes. It's also doing processes during sleep of like cleaning out waste from neurons. So there's a lot of weird activity happening in your brain that doesn't look like a conscious experience. Your brain's doing stuff, but it doesn't look like awakeness. And that's one of the reasons we think some dreams kind of put things together is because, well, we do have memories being activated, but we've also got a lot of other things, a lot of habits, procedural memories that are being strengthened. So, but yeah, people tend to not remember things that they were experiencing during stage 4 sleep. A little more in stage 3 and definitely more in stage 2 and 1. But main point here, after that sleep tangent, is deep sleep is associated with more memory reactivation if we've forgotten something. So for someone who doesn't remember their 5th birthday or something like that, maybe it was a really fun one. They saw a picture and they're like, oh man, I do not remember getting that dinosaur toy. I didn't remember that dinosaur toy at all. If you get more deep sleep and you kind of try to remind yourself of that, you might be able to, essentially, your brain is going to be making more neuron connections during that. And so you might be able to trigger that neuron and re-remember, reactivate that memory network. Because remember, memories can be lost. These neurons, they are cells, they want to be energy efficient. You have memories that you've had before that are now basically gone because the neurons are like, oh, well, we're not being activated very much, so we're going to lose these connections. We're going to reabsorb these axon branches or these dendrite branches. We're not using this connection, so we don't need so many receptor cells in this synapse. So we can forget things. But this consolidation happens primarily during resting states and most especially in stage 4 sleep, the deepest sleep. All right, so that is the encoding and storage piece of this. What about retrieval? Well, retrieval is just accessing that stored information. And really what that is at the neural level is connecting to that neural network, making that neural network, pulling it into working memory. So we retrieve procedural memories and declarative memories. So declarative are the episodic memories. They're the things that we usually think of as memories. So the first time you rode a bike, that would be, and remembering what happened, you got hurt, but then you were really excited that you figured it out. That would be a declarative or episodic memory. The remembering, the kind of muscle memory, for lack of a better term right now, is the procedural memory. How do you ride a bike? How do you use a spoon? That's a procedural memory. So you access those. You have to retrieve those things. And interestingly, we see that different states, this retrieval is also state and context dependent. The more connections that you have for that engram, for that memory network, the easier it is to retrieve that memory. And this includes the states and contexts that you're in. So states includes like the state of consciousness. So if you are studying for your midterm exam and you have caffeine as you are studying, you will do better on the exam if you also have caffeine because your brain is using that state, that same state. Similarly, if you're studying without caffeine, you should probably take the exam without caffeine too, because that is the same state. So you have the neurons connected specifically in that different state of mind. Context is also important too. Context is more like the setting. If you've ever thought of, well, how do I remember something that I've forgotten? Well, after you leave a room, one thing that can help is go back to that original room. You have context clues, setting clues that will help you trigger what your brain was just doing. Same thing with memories. If you're taking the exam example again, if you are studying in the same corner of the library every day and you're able to, you'd probably do better on the exam if you take the exam in that same corner of the library because there's context clues from your class. It would actually be a really good idea. You might not want to do this because you have to like pack up, but if you're studying in say a library or a home office or you have enough spaces, you could study for one class in one spot, another class in another spot, and another class in another spot, and then take the tests for each of those classes in that same spot. You'll do a little bit better. It'll be a little easier to remember because your brain has an easier time activating that memory network. And that goes back to mnemonics as well. With mnemonics, you're trying to visually, auditorily, any other way, trying to make it easier to connect to that memory, to activate those neurons that are part of the memory. So that's also why trauma can be such a hard thing because it's really easy to activate that memory. So that can be a big problem for people, whether it's anxiety, PTSD, things like this. But we can use this as a tool and a trick to help our brains activate those memory networks. And so that's what retrieval is. Retrieval is accessing that stored information, calling up that long-term memory, working with it right now. So again, a memory is made up of many different brain areas working together to do that encoding process, the consolidation process, and the retrieval process. So the next part of the lecture here is on the specific brain areas related to memory. The hippocampus is very important for things like those place cells, the grid cells, for starting to encode that memory. The hippocampus is essential. So with that, we are also learning now. The reason these images are here as well is because this is a hippocampus cut out of a person. And this is the reason it was called the hippocampus, the water horse, because it looks like a seahorse. Also, to remember it, the mnemonic that I used one of the first weeks of class was a hippo, right? So hippos remember better than elephants. So that's helping me remember. So here is a hippocamp. You can go to hippocamp. Apparently, this is actually a kid's TV show. I haven't watched it. I just found the image and stole it off the internet. But hippocampus, it is essential for memory. And what we're learning is that different specific areas of the hippocampus are important to specific types of memories. So grid cells and place cells are in one specific area of the hippocampus. Emotional memories and talking to the amygdala are in another place of the hippocampus. So we're seeing and getting more knowledge that it is more specific to specific areas. Again, there's a little bit of overlap and adjustment, but just like we have similar brain areas across humans, most humans have kind of specific areas in their hippocampus for specific types of memory processes. So you could have one part of this hippocampus that's talking to the prefrontal cortex, another that's talking to the amygdala, another that's got the place cells or the grid cells. But yeah, those are connected to those specific areas of the cortex. So the hippocampus, as a reminder, is part of the limbic system. So it's very connected to the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain. It's also connected to the entorhinal cortex, the perineal cortex, and the parahippocampal cortex. And so you can see those here. And those are also very important for declarative memory. And I don't think we've talked about the definition of that, but declarative memory is those things like episodic memory where you remember an event. So you remembered what happened on your fifth birthday or the vacation. Any kind of autobiographical memory would fit under that declarative memory. So a lot of these structures that are very essential for memory are really close to each other there in the middle of the brain. But again, we've got white matter that connects to the gray matter all around the outside edge of the brain. And those are important for the actual storage and retrieval. So the hippocampus in these areas will help write those memories, but then usually those memories are mostly stored there and kind of activated from other things, or these areas can help you recall those memories. So lots of specific areas in the hippocampus and connected to the hippocampus, very important for memory. Um, with the hippocampus, with these place and grid cells, it's very, very useful for spatial connections and temporal connections. So temporal connections, I'm talking about time. Spatial connections, I'm talking about like 3D space. So oftentimes when we have a memory, we connect temporal connections and spatial connections to them, so we have a better network of things. So a spatial connection would be like, hey, class is on the third floor of the building, or my seat is near the window. We have an idea of the place, and that's piece of that memory network is another piece that you can connect onto that helps you remember and builds that network. So that's spatial connections. And we do this when we visualize too. If we're visualizing and using a mnemonic like the method of loci, we are using spatial connections of, say, a house or a room or a park, someplace that we know really well and can imagine ourselves in visually. We're using spatial connections. The hippocampus does that really well. It's a very important piece of that puzzle, but also temporal connections. You might have a connection that, oh, class is in the evening. The midterm is happening soon, but the final exam is far away. So these, and you can also see the idea of far away also connects temporal and spatial. Some of the things that we have as descriptions of time are also descriptions of space. Our conception of something being far away time-wise is also connecting to spatial connections in our brain. So we're using some of those grid cells to do that kind of thing, to use the hippocampus to make sense of things, to put things together. And it does this pretty well so that we can have an idea of when, where things are happening, when or where we were for a family camping trip. So my spatial connections were all in this, some SUV that my family had at that time. So that was my spatial connections. So they're all mixed together. And then the temporal connections were within a year of each other. So it kind of mixed those memories up for me. Right? But those are things that our brain does and our hippocampus specifically is doing. We have a lot of knowledge about the hippocampus. We've investigated it in a lot of detail, especially in rats and other animals. And remember, the hippocampus is also one of the places that we do neurogenesis even as adults. So it might have some impact. It doesn't seem to have a dramatic impact, but the fact that we do have neurogenesis is a positive thing. So another thing is similar to the temporal connections and the spatial connections, we also do a lot of item context binding in the hippocampus. So this puts things together with setting, space, and time. So we might have a mug. So I have a mug here. So this mug also I got when I got my PhD, and so it has a time on it. So I have this idea of this mug, and I have a space in time. I have emotions connected to finishing my PhD, and those items are bound and connected to finishing that PhD, the kinds of feelings that I was having, how I had my desk set up. It was actually in a different location than I am right now when I finished my PhD. And all of those, the spatial, temporal, setting, items that were there, those are all connected. And the hippocampus does that, is a really big piece of putting those connections together. So, and the main idea behind that is the more connections you have with something, the easier it is to remember. So it's a really well evolved structure to help us make connections, both with time, both with space, both with items, both with settings. And so that is a big part of what it's doing. So some other examples, I gave my example there, but can you think of what does your grandma's house smell like? Or what did your grandma's house smell like? What it is, what's around you when you had that first kiss? Uh, does the thought of your favorite soda help activate other memories? So maybe you have a favorite soda, but you can also remember an event where you were drinking that favorite soda, right? So that soda is tied to some of those other memories. All right, so hippocampus is essentially using these things, these connections, these physical connections between neurons, new dendrite branches, new axon branches, strengthening connections at synapses, making it easier for, at the cellular level, making it easier for the next cells in line to fire and to have a pattern where they do fire frequently, having networks of neurons like grid cells that put things together. So remember that engram, that specific neural network, is spread out all over your brain, but you can also use some pieces of the hippocampus to tie those together, to strengthen those, and even to reactivate those as well. So again, an engram is some of those neurons that were active during the memory itself. So another brain area that's very important to memory is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex does a lot of what we call higher order brain functions, things that humans do that other animals don't seem to do as well. It's very essential for active, conscious work with information. So thinking about an example. So if I said, think about an example of when you were confused. Think about a time when you set a goal. What is a big goal that you have? You're going to be using your prefrontal cortex. It also is very important for pulling out old long-term information to actively decide. So if you're trying to decide, oh, I need to finish my graduation plan, what classes have I taken? Like which categories do these classes fill? You're going to be pulling out some long-term information. So this is, you can think of your prefrontal cortex kind of as where you, your conscious experience, your personality, yourself live, but obviously you're actively processing using the rest of your brain, other connections, body connections as well. So it's not just there, but you can kind of think of that as being like you're kind of running your body mech suit from your prefrontal cortex. So there is other aspects of you. It's not just a couple cells here. It's the whole package is you. But the prefrontal cortex is very important for a lot of those memories. It's very important for working memory, which we haven't described in this lecture in a lot of detail, but that is the active process of working with information. And we'll get to some of those specific definitions in a moment. So the striatum is a very close, again, to the midbrain. It is very close to the hippocampus. And so habits or procedural memories seem to be very dependent on this area. Just like declarative or episodic memories are very important for the hippocampus, striatum for the process of riding your bike, or where's the A, B, C, and D on your keyboard in your office, right? So knowing where those keyboard keys are, or like, I can't pull it up, or like where your fingers are going to go, that is the striatum that has some of those connections. What about your fingerprint sensor on your phone? If you pick up your phone and you touch the fingerprint sensor, it might change, right? You might need to learn a new pattern if you get a new phone. Oftentimes urged to do habits. Even connections to reward systems and learning are here in the striatum. So very important for a lot of memories. Maybe you can also see that there could be some connections related to addiction here as well. If we have habits and reward centers of the brain tied in through here in the striatum, it's an important piece of the addiction puzzle. So continuing on, we've talked about the amygdala already, but yes, emotions, emotional ties to memories. If you're thinking of a happy versus a sad memory, your amygdala is going to be activated. It's part of the neocortex that has that neural network. It's some of those 1,000 neurons for any given memory. So the basolateral amygdala is a specific spot in the amygdala, and it's especially important. It's doing a lot of that stress hormone bit. So stress hormones and neurotransmitters, they're important to consolidate memories. That is in the basolateral amygdala. So really important piece of creating memories. It is also connected to anxiety and PTSD. So some other brain areas and a little quicker. So some of these we've talked about already. So hippocampus, direction of memory storage, prefrontal cortex is a lot of working memory and active engagement, amygdala, emotional components, but the olfactory bulb as well. The olfactory bulb is an interesting component of your brain. It acts very uniquely or separate, but also connected. But it has a lot of connection with smell and chemical senses. And so that's one reason smell and is so tied to emotion and the hippocampus. It's a very close bit of your brain organ. It's very close to the amygdala, to the hippocampus. It's also one area that we do some neurogenesis, interestingly. So the smell of, say, grandma's house might be tied to memories. The smell of a specific kind of cookie, right? Might remember. I also can remember the smell of a mall I used to live nearby because I used to do like walks around the mall. That was in California. So my kids would love to like go to the Disney store when they were really little, like really little. But it had a specific smell. Some of it was a good smell, like the pretzels. Some of it was not as good of a smell. But I remember that smell. It's tied to those memories. So the infotemporal cortex, which I believe, yep, it is highlighted right here, is one of those outside bits of the temporal lobe, and it has a lot of visual functions. It's got memory stored there of visual patterns, faces, like facial detectors are there, shapes as well. There's little networks of neurons that learn, hey, so when you're in preschool learning this is a square, this is a triangle, those are stored in your infotemporal cortex. So parts of some sensory memories, because there's some of the somatosensory cortex that overlaps there. So somatosensory cortex is either right here or right here. One of these is the motor cortex. One of these lines is the somatosensory cortex. I'm going to say this is the somatosensory cortex, but I might be flipping those. But if that memory has touch or temperature or pain in areas of the body, that piece of the memory, the memory of the pain or the memory of the pleasant touch, might be connected to that bit of the network. So, first kiss example, probably your lips and the neurons, some of the neurons that were active during that time, those neurons that detect lip touch are probably active. So cerebellum, many procedural memories. So cerebellum helps with a lot of different things, as we've talked about. It's like a little brain. It does more than just balance. It's part of a lot of habits. So it's going to be working with the striatum that's around here as well. The orbitofrontal cortex is over here. I don't think that one's actually marked on this map, but positive emotional memories are there as well. So we see a lot of positive memories have more connection to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is really interesting. But those are a bunch of different areas that are very heavily involved in a lot of different memories. So the hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the olfactory bulb, the IT cortex, the cerebellum, the somatosensory cortex, all of those would be talking to each other for any given memory. So when you remember grandma's house or that Thanksgiving dinner that was really great, or your time in seventh grade when you had your first kiss or whatever it might be, when you remember that, you are literally activating some of the neurons all over your brain. And again, the hippocampus is really important for starting to set those memories and those memory networks. But depending on how strong those memory networks, they can also be triggered by other things, maybe by a smell or by the taste of something or by the sound of a song. Maybe your first kiss was at a middle school dance or something like that, and a specific song was playing. So now that song activates that memory. All right, so our memories are all over our brain in a big network. Again, it's about 10% of the neurons that were active during the actual event. So, and talking to each other. All right, next we will talk about some different terms that are in your book, but hopefully now you have a lot better sense of these different kinds of memory areas, what's going on as we talk about the terms, because your book kind of puts these terms at the beginning of the chapter. I put this at the end of the lecture because I really want you to understand the neurobiology before you dive into these terms. So again, you've got some more connections. So I think that's a good way to do it. So the first term I want to go over is retention, and we have talked about this one already. This is just the ability to keep information over time. So retention is really important for these memories, keeping them there, having the networks accessible. That is retention. So retaining that memory in our mind and then being able to activate it for that retrieval later on. A piece that we haven't actually talked about, but hopefully makes a lot of sense, is attention. So going back to my example earlier of not really remembering, I'm sure I saw some birds when I was driving around the Puget Sound the other day, but I do remember I was paying attention to my driving at that intersection that was annoying, and I paid attention, and that's another reason I remembered that. So attention is very important for memory, for cognitive development, and for retaining the memory. If I'm not attending to something, I'm not going to remember it. If I saw really quickly a raccoon on the side of a road, but I didn't really pay attention and I didn't care, then that's not going to become a part of the memory. So attention and is important for retention. All right, so a couple other pieces. Sensory memory specifically is the raw data from the senses. So any information coming from your eyes, coming from your ears, coming from your taste buds, coming from the sensors in your skin, and sensory memory only lasts a few milliseconds to the longest is a few seconds. So I should have double checked this, but I believe our chemical senses retain sensory memory the longest. Eyes are one of the shortest. Eyes don't retain sensory information for very long, but they can retain it for a little bit. So the idea of iconic memory is your visual sensory memory. It's the reason you can write your name or draw a circle really quickly with a sparkler in the air, because your sensory memory still has that sensation of light that it's still sending actively to your brain. So that's what a sensory memory it is. It is those cells still sending that information to your brain so you can pick it up, work with it in your prefrontal cortex, your working memory, the other memory systems like the hippocampus and other areas of your brain. That very short time of getting that sensory data into your brain and the length of that, we call that sensory memory because there's a little bit of retention. You're still getting that input of that signal. So being able to see the circle of this O in the word love, that comes because of sensory memory. Jumping forward to short term memory is what we describe any information that we're retaining for about 30 seconds if we're not actually working for it. There can be a lot of information that that if it seems important, we might hang on to for about 30 seconds. For a lot of the research here, we do digits like random words or random letter sequences or random number sequences. And so a 2-year-old can remember about a 2-digit sequence without doing anything. Again, this is no rehearsal. They're not re-repeating it to each other. After about 30 seconds, they can remember about a 2-digit sequence. About a 7-year-old remembers about 5 digits. And then in late childhood, early adolescence, it kind of peaks at about 6, 7 digits. And so we see some slow gains after that, but the biggest gains are if you're intentionally trying to practice. So that's short-term memory. It's a very passive system. Short-term memory, it's like something's automatically put into your field of view or put onto shelves in your mind, and then it just disappears on its own based on your attention. If you're not paying attention, it'll go out of your attention, it'll go out of your short-term memory, and it's got about a 7 plus or minus 2 ability in an adult. So some adults might be at 5, some adults might be at about 9, and then if you work on it, you can get a little bit better than that if you're intentionally practicing your short-term memory. So here is first, before we look at the text of the slide, I just want to look at the picture of Dory here. This is kind of short-term memory. Something appears in your memory, your short-term memory, and then if you don't do anything with it, it goes away. Something's there, goes away. That's the idea of short-term memory. It's very passive. Things jump onto the shelves in your mind and then jump off all by themselves. So with this, how do we improve it? Well, we work with the information. We bring in our prefrontal cortex to the process. We start using it in working memory. We can chunk things together. Chunking is a term that means grouping them all into one unit. So you can group multiple numbers into one unit. So oftentimes our phone numbers, at least here in the US, we kind of remember the first three numbers as one chunk, the second three numbers and one chunk, and the last four numbers as a chunk. That's one example of chunking. Another good thing is to rehearse it, to just intentionally keep it there in your mind. So you're kind of holding on, you're attending to it, you're re-repeating it to yourself. So this also is getting into the area of working memory. Once you start working with that information, it's working memory. So this is also why the term working memory and the idea of working memory has kind of superseded short-term memory, because it's the active mental workbench. It's the stuff that you are actually using. Something has come in from your sensory memory and jumped onto your short-term memory shelf, and now you're working with it. So now it's really the responsibility of working memory. So while we do have that short-term memory, things can kind of sit there for a little bit and then just disappear. Really, when we're talking about memory and actively trying to remember things, mostly what we're doing is using our working memory. So I often try to think of this like visually as the table the inside out characters are at. They are making decisions, they're manipulating information, they're calling up long-term memories and trying to decide what to do. So your decisions, your understanding of language, solving of problems, setting of goals, all of this is happening in connection with your prefrontal cortex, and this capacity for working memory improves through adolescence and into adulthood. So anytime you are actively doing something, actively manipulating information, it's in use. So we're going to watch some of this TED Talk. I am going to speed it up just a little bit. If it's too fast for you, feel free to either slow my video down or go back to this original video link. And again, if ever my videos don't work, it just means I had to cut it out. TED Talks are fine. They are OER material, so I don't get copyright struck on them. But one of the earlier videos, I'm afraid, might delete itself when I upload this to YouTube. So with that being said, we're going to watch just the first 7 minutes. There's an activity that he asks you to do, that the speaker asks you to do at the beginning of this to test out your working memory. Try it. Try to do the things that he requests in your own while you are watching/listening to this lecture.
So yesterday, I was out on the street in front of this building, and I was walking down the sidewalk, and I had company, several of us, and we were all abiding by the rules of walking down sidewalks. Okay, we're not talking to each other, we're facing forward, we're moving. When the person in front of me slows down, and so I'm watching him, and he slows down, and finally he stops. Well, that wasn't fast enough for me. So I put on my turn signal, and I walked around him. And as I walked, I looked to see what he was doing, and he was doing this. He was texting. And he couldn't text and walk at the same time. Now, we could approach this from a working memory perspective or from a multitasking perspective. We're going to do working memory today. Now, working memory is that part of our consciousness that we are aware of at any given time of day. You're doing it right now. It's not something we can turn off. If you turn it off, that's called a coma. Okay? So right now, you're doing just fine. Now, working memory has 4 basic components. It allows us to store some immediate experiences and a little bit of knowledge. It allows us to reach back into our long-term memory and pull some of that in as we need it, mixes it, processes it, in light of whatever our current goal is. Now, the current goal isn't something like I want to be president or the best surfer in the world. It's more mundane. I'd like that cookie, or I need to figure out how to get into my hotel room. Okay? Now, working memory capacity is our ability to leverage that, our ability to take what we know and what we can hang on to and leverage it in ways that allow us to satisfy our current goal. Okay? Now, working memory capacity has a fairly long history, and it's associated with a lot of positive effects. People with high working memory capacity tend to be good storytellers. They tend to solve and do well on standardized tests, however important that is. Okay? They're able to have high levels of writing ability. They're also able to reason at high levels. So what we're going to do here is play a little bit with some of that. So I'm going to ask you to perform a couple tasks, and we're going to take your working memory out for a ride. You up for that? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you 5 words, and I just want you to hang on to them. Don't write them down. Just hang on to them. 5 words. While you're hanging on to them, I'm going to ask you to answer 3 questions. I want to see what happens with those words. So here's the words. Tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. So far, so good? Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what the answer is to 23 times 8. Just shout it out. 24. In fact, it's exactly. All right. I want you to take out your left hand, and I want you to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a neurological test, just in case you're wondering. All right. Now what I want you to do is to recite the last 5 letters of the English alphabet backwards.
X.
You should have started with Z. Right.
U.
All right. How many people here are still pretty sure you've got all 5 words? Okay. Typically, we end up with about less than half, right? Which is normal. There'll be a range. Some people can hang on to 5, some can hang on to 10, some will be down to 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function. Okay? And it's going to be really important here at TED because you're going to be exposed to so many different ideas. Now, the problem that we have is that life comes at us, and it comes at us very quickly. And what we need to do is to take that amorphous flow of experience and somehow extract meaning from it with a working memory that's about the size of a pea. Now, don't get me wrong, working memory is awesome.
I do want to interject right now. When he says the working memory is about the size of a pea, essentially that's about the size of how many neurons you're bringing into the process to do the process of working memory. So again, you're using lots of different areas in the network, but like physical size-wise, you're using about as many neurons as the size of a pea. So it's not to say that it's not using a big area of the brain, right? So there are some specific areas of like the hippocampus that are talking to the prefrontal cortex for this, but size-wise, it's not a ton of like the mass to do some of this focus and processing.
Okay? Working memory allows us to investigate our current experience as we move forward. It allows us to make sense of the world around us. Okay? But it does have certain limits. Now, working memory is great for allowing us to communicate. We can have a conversation, and I can build a narrative around that. So I know where we've been and where we're going and how to contribute to this conversation. Allows us to problem solve, critical think. We can be in the middle of a meeting, listen to somebody's presentation, evaluate it, decide whether or not we like it, ask follow-up questions. All of that occurs within working memory. It also allows us to go to the store and allows us to get milk and eggs and cheese when what we're really looking for is Red Bull and bacon. Okay? Got to make sure we're getting what we're looking for. Now, a central issue with working memory is that it's limited. It's limited in capacity, limited in duration, limited in focus. We tend to remember about 4 things. Okay, it used to be 7, but with functional MRIs, apparently it's 4. We were overachieving, all right? Now, we can remember those 4 things for about 10 to 20 seconds unless we do something with it, unless we process it, unless we apply it to something, unless we talk to somebody about it. When we think about working memory, we have to realize that this limited capacity has lots of different impacts on us. Have you ever walked from one room to another and then forgotten why you're there? Okay. You do know the solution to that, right? You go back to that original room. Okay? Right? Have you ever forgotten your keys? You ever forgotten your car? You ever forgotten your kids? Okay? Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually more interesting? All right? So you're nodding and you're smiling, but you're really paying attention to this one over here until you hear that last word go up and you realize you've been asked a question. And you're really hoping the answer is no, because that's what you're about to say. Okay? All of that talks about working memory, what we can do and what we can't do. We need to realize that working memory has a limited capacity, and that working memory capacity itself is how we negotiate that. We negotiate that through strategies.
So we'll pause that before he goes into strategies. We'll be talking about some of these strategies, and we've already alluded to a few of those, especially visual and making connections and mnemonics. So that is working memory. It is that working mental workbench where you're actively engaged with things that are going on right now. So with that, if you look at these 2 different scenarios, maybe the same thing is happening. Maybe in both of these settings, kids are trying to, or teenagers, you look about teenager age, are trying to flirt with each other. So this person is paying attention to their phone, maybe a person that they're texting or DMing. These people are maybe supposed to be working on an assignment, but they're flirting with each other. So what is happening in their working memory? Well, they're probably emotions, right? So here you've got amygdala, and amygdala all working and focusing on this. You've got prefrontal cortex, all thinking about things, right? So this person really has to focus on the text. They have to try to interpret. So based on these words, based on what I'm seeing, based on the emojis. What does this mean? How should I interpret this? This pulls into the language area of the brain. Here, these people, they might be having to try to pretend that they're paying attention to the class, and so be doing that. But they're also trying to think of, oh, I should be listening to this other person. I should be maybe trying to think of something clever to say while they're maybe trying to get their assignment done. So there's different parts of their experience that are active that they're working with right then. So they're trying to reason, they're trying to try and interpret the looks. Here you can get some facial expressions versus here you're not going to get those facial expressions, right? Unless they're on a video call. But let's say they're just texting, right? So they're just texting, they're not getting facial expressions. They don't have to focus on facial expressions. Here, they both have facial expressions. They might both have to focus on interpreting the other person's facial expression as well as displaying their own emotion, right? So their working memory have some similar things going on, but because of the different form of communication, there's some differences too. So hopefully that helps you think about working memory as another example of being actively engaged and using long-term memory, using the active, the pieces that are coming at you, the inputs from your senses in any given moment. So when you have good working memory, the video talked about this, people have good math skills, good problem solving skills, good reasoning skills, good writing skills. It makes sense. If you're able to hang on to a bunch of relevant information at one time, you can plan out a story, or you can be more detailed, or you can put things together in a way where someone who had a little bit less capacity would have a harder time doing it at that level. That being said, working memory is something you can improve. So using it, trying it out will make more connections in your brain to allow you to use more working memory. All right, so long-term memory is what we call that relatively permanent memory. It's when those networks are now in the neocortex and they're kind of solid there. You can trigger them, you can recall them. So it seems to have a large capacity. It may be infinite with the kinds of connections, and we have so many neurons that it makes sense that we can build that many different networks. The quantity and the quality of the memories does depend on the strategies we use. Again, I don't remember the animals or the birds on the sides of the road yesterday, but I do remember being focused on at that intersection, so I didn't hit any cars. So the quality of the memory of don't hit cars is a lot higher than the quality and quantity of the memory of animals on the road. So we do see long-term memory increases in middle and late childhood. It probably grows in adolescence too, and that seems to be about where it gets to its on average peak point, but you can work on this as well. You can build your long-term memory capacity, your ability to connect to those memories through your life as well. So the long-term memory works with the working memory. It works with things like the visual spatial sketchpad is not in your book, but this is basically a theorized area of your brain that does the visualizations of things. So you're using the occipital lobe, you're using those areas of the hippocampus with grid cells, and you are able to visualize things. The phonological loop is kind of the same thing, but for auditory things. So whether it's sound or language, you're using those areas of the brain at the same time. And the episodic buffer is other context setting item clues that you're connecting these memories to. So central executive, working memory is helping with these and putting it into long-term memory. Again, at the beginning, the hippocampus is very involved in this process. Over time, though, these connections in these different parts of your brain are kind of independent of the hippocampus, although depending on what the memory is, you still might be using it. So with long-term memory, we have non-declarative or implicit memory. So these are also called procedural memories. These are things that we acquire and use unconsciously. So through our experience of learning how to use a spoon, learning how to ride a bike, and with the brain plasticity, we have retained these over time. We did have to learn them and we had to make them a memory. But these are like skills, motor actions, how to use a spoon, how to throw a football, how to ride a bike, where the stick shift is in your car, or the shifter is on your motorcycle, right? These kinds of things that we don't have to like consciously think about. they are stored a little bit differently, but it is a type of long-term memory. It stays there for a long time. It's relatively permanent. If you don't drive a manual transmission car for a while, maybe it'll get weaker, but usually you can reactivate, reconnect with those memories. So declarative or explicit memories are what we usually think of as memories. They're those conscious facts, experiences. Most research suggests that explicit memory before your age 2 kind of just fades away, and that's partially because the brain is figuring out how to make memories, how to connect up these networks, those kinds of things. Also, you're still doing a lot of neurogenesis and moving things at that time, so your brain is learning how to do its job. So what we see is this is kind of a breakdown of the age range of how long-term memories seem to exist. So it's hard. It is a hard thing to investigate. If you go into a lifespan development class, it's really tough to figure out about the memories of a 6-month-old. They can't communicate with words. They might be able to have some signs, but there's other methods to test those. All right, so with this, semantic memory is specifically those like facts and general knowledge that we have. This isn't personal experience type stuff. This is like, what planet is the largest? You're pulling on your semantic memory, those things you learned in, say, third grade or from the magic school bus. What is the preamble to the US Constitution? The other day I was trying to remember it and I actually had to review it because I'm like, there's some bits of that I'm missing. So I had to review it. And so that's my semantic memory. I strengthen that connection. It'll be there more solid going forward thinking about it. You can see most of it here if you can read that cursive on your screen or just look it up. It's a good thing to review. So with that, that's semantic memory. Facts, general knowledge. Episodic memory are those types of declarative or explicit long-term memories that are like an episode of your life. So something that happened, some event. Here, maybe your first time learning to drive a car, or maybe your first time teaching someone to drive a car, or the firstborn child that you have. This child, when I was searching for pictures of babies being born, apparently this was in one of the New York hospitals. This was the first baby born on New Year's Day from the current year when I'm recording this video. So that was pretty cool to see. But that is often emotionally connected, right? You're learning to drive a car. This person looks very worried. This person looks like they might be scared. This person looks very happy. This person is asleep, but infants can have emotions as well. Probably those memories from this time. This little one's brain is figuring out how to make memories. Probably going to have none of those from that day or even the next couple days. But the parent will, right? Until they're lacking sleep and not being able to get the deep sleep that they need, they're going to have a hard time making some of those long-term memories and consolidating those. So that's one thing that is pretty common with parents of very new babies, a lack of deep sleep. So with that being said, that is what an episodic memory of is. If you can think back to your high school prom or when your child was born or the time you went to this concert, that is an episodic memory. And it's usually these kinds of declarative or explicit memories are what we think of for memory. All right, so now we'll get to forgetting. Why do we forget things? And then how can we resist our brains forgetting things? So some of the main reasons we forget are, one, encoding failures. We didn't actually take that information and put it into a recording place in a way that we can access. So decay also happens. Again, these memories are stored across the neural network. So those connections can fade over time. If we're not activating it, it's going to, over time, retract or absorb or recycle some of those dendrite branches. It will also have weaker connections between those synapses, so they can decay over time. Inadequate retrieval cues, so this goes back to encoding, so we don't have enough connections to grab that memory. So oftentimes this kind of happens when you're trying to think of something on the tip of your tongue. It's like you're close, you're really close, you're getting some networks, but you're not getting the exact right network, the tip of the tongue phenomenon. You don't have enough retrieval cues. So adding these, so doing a better job at encoding, not letting the memory decay, or adding more retrieval cues can help you remember. Interference is another one, and one of the examples that I've given during this lecture is a really good example. I had those 2 trips that are now one memory. those memories of both those trips are getting in the way of the other trip. So it's interfered. So trying not to remember it, you can intentionally try to push things out of your mind. You can intentionally ignore things or try not to remember something. So you can intentionally forget over time. So this is also the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So this is always a sad one to look at because let's say you're in a classroom setting and you are hearing 100% of the information I'm sharing. This video is probably going to end up being 1 hour and 40 minutes to 2 hours long for this lecture. So with that, you have probably already, by the time you finish the lecture, forgotten about 60% of the information that I've already shared. So hopefully you have read the book already, so you already have some connections to make. And we've been talking about some of these principles, so hopefully it's not that dramatic for you because you already have some background, some networks to connect it to. But if it's brand new information, someone's name, a whole classroom a whole classroom of students' names, you're gonna, within about an hour, forget about 60% of those names. So, and then a positive thing is if you remember something for about a week, you will probably continue to remember it for a long period of time. There's not a lot of drop off after about a week, but there's a lot of drop off very soon after you've learned something. So, 50% loss in about 20 minutes, 70% loss after about 24 hours, which is really disappointing for someone teaching classes to think about. And it's one reason I try to make connections in a lot of ways. But that's one of the things that we can do to remember. We can do a better job encoding. We can make more connections as we are encoding. You first learn something with maybe reading the book before class. Then you come to class and you're learning those things again in a different way. So you're flattening out that forgetting curve. Then maybe you review your notes or finish the rest of the lecture in a hybrid activity. Or maybe you are studying it before a test a few days later. Or before a quiz. And then you've got maybe the midterm exam coming up or the final exam coming up. So you study it again. So each of those times you are flattening out the forgetting curve, you are remembering and retaining more and more of that information. And that is why I've structured my classes the way that I do, because I know about this. And this is something you can intentionally do as well in anything that you're learning new. You can practice it, you can review it. The more times it gets reviewed, the better it's going to be stuck in your long-term memory. So with this, there are other types of forgetting, amnesia, whether it's anterior grade, which is not being able to store new information, or retrograde amnesia, an ability to receive past information. And depending on which one it is, if you have anterior grade or retrograde, there's a couple different brain areas that your book goes into more detail with that could have damage or problems to lead to that. All right, so some of these terms in memory errors we've already covered a few moments ago, and they're just put in different ways. So essentially, all of these things, like suggestibility, we've referred to earlier today. This is false memories or slightly altered memories, and that is one thing that can happen to memory, as well as transience. That memory has now faded. Absent-mindedness, you weren't attending to it, so it doesn't get encoded. Blocking, we can't access that because it's blocked by other information. We're not grabbing the correct network. Misattribution, we get it confused where that memory comes from. Bias or persistence, so we're trying not to remember things or we are not able to remember certain things. But suggestibility is one that I want to focus on for just a minute because it's really similar in process to some of the other things. It goes back to what I was talking about, how I couldn't make a new memory of meeting an actual dinosaur. Right? Maybe a robot dinosaur, but not a real dinosaur because that's so far outside of reality that I can't suggest my memory that far away from reality. So memories can shift, can move a little bit. Let's say you're thinking about your first kiss and you had a really bad breakup. Maybe now that memory is a little changed, whereas it used to have a lot of happiness involved in it. Now it has sadness over it. Right? So you have now shifted that memory a little bit, but it's not so far, you weren't kissing a dinosaur, right? So you cannot suggest a completely false memory. It has to be something that people can connect to. A good example of something that people can create a false memory of was tested in young children. So a lot of children were able to, in an experimental setting, a parent told them a fake story of a time where they got lost in a mall, and the parent found them like half an hour later in a circle of clothes crying. So it didn't actually happen to any of these kids, but the parent told them about this time, and later on, a couple weeks later, the kid came back and was able to tell the story and remembered that pretty often. So like I can't remember the exact number, but 70+% of the people could remember that. Alternatively, they try to implant another false memory. So an enema is a process where you essentially put fluids into a person's body versus through the mouth, it's through the anus. And so it's a medical procedure that is not commonly done, but like it could be done, right? And so the other memory that was tried to implant in these kids was the story of a time, and this wasn't the same kids, it was two different groups. So one got the story of the getting lost in the mall, another got the story of an enema. So the parent again told them, yeah, we went to the doctor. This is how the procedure happened. This is what happened with your body. This is why it was happening, right? So they tried to implant that false memory. Then a couple weeks later, they tried to ask kids how much they remembered, and almost none of the kids remembered the false memory of the enema. Basically none. So it goes to show that, well, it kind of makes sense. Being able to connect to networks that already exist for something like getting lost in the store. Probably a lot of those kids have gotten lost in a store for a short time. So it's not too much of a stretch or a suggestion to say, I was lost not for 30 seconds, but 30 minutes. That's a lot less of a stretch than some medical procedure that's never ever happened. So it goes to show, one, believe children when they say something has happened to them. They might not have the proper words or the context of what happened, but believe them when they say something happened, because false memories that are completely false are not a thing. Slightly shifted or changed, definitely a possibility. So that goes into a whole other discussion, though. But that is an important thing to know about memory, is that we can shift it, we can move it. A happy memory could become sad. A memory of being lost in a store for a couple minutes could become a lot more dramatic and a fish tale, right? The fish gets a little bigger every time you tell it. You might actually have a false memory now and remember that fish was this big when really it was this big. So some other specific things with memory. Memory study tips: review your notes frequently, check for errors, put in new examples, put in new connections you think of later on, arrange it into memorable structures, however that works for you. I have classmates that like to make like word bubbles, like this concept's connected to this concept and this concept on like big whiteboards. I didn't like doing that, but I like to have like outlines of topics and things like that. Experiment with a variety of techniques for notes. So hierarchies, networks, analogies, making connections. Essentially what you're trying to do is spread that brain network wider. Make it so this brain network and this brain network can talk to each other. Then it's going to be easier to activate either of those. Give undivided attention. When you're in class, I say to students on first day of class, don't be on, say, TikTok or Reddit on your computer. Be focused on the class. If you're attending class, you're going to remember things. Process it deeply. So think of actual relevant associations to yourself that are more real or relevant. Use imagery. We've talked about imagery quite a few times. It's a strong part of your hippocampus that can use imagery. Use chunking, so put concepts together, put little bits together. Encode early and often. So be doing this process. Get enough rest. Take breaks while you're studying. If you take breaks and you're resting during your break, it's giving your brain a chance to be working on encoding that information. Redo notes, talk to others about the things you've learned, kind of report to other people. Test yourself. You can make up tests. You can write your own test questions. You can look forward to study guides and test yourself. Essay questions tend to be the best for this. So even if you don't have exams in a class that are essay style, it makes you kind of recall more information, tie it together, and take breaks during studying. So we tend to, as well as the forgetting curve, we tend to remember the things at the beginning of a study session and the end of a study session the best. So if you take breaks, so again, if this video was 2 hours long. If you've taken two breaks during the course of this lecture video, that would be a really great example. And those breaks can be short. The best recommendation is, depending on your brain and your attention, how cognitively taxing it is for you, somewhere between about 25 minutes to 45 minutes should be about how far you go before taking a break. If you take a break at 25 minutes, maybe like a 2 or 3 minute break, so go get some coffee filled up, go look at the birds or something like that, then come back to work. If you go a whole 45 minutes, take a whole like 7-10 minute break. And figure out what works for your brain. For my brain, especially with ADHD, the 25 or 35 minutes, that's about my limit. I go and take some breaks. But depending on your brain, you might be able to go that 45. But don't go past that, because your cognitive capacity, your cognitive ability will decline. Even if you're like, oh, I just have 5 more minutes, I can push through. That 5 minutes, when your brain is at its limit, it's going to take you a little longer than if you took that break and then came back and did it. Another big thing is, especially in classes, switching your studying between different classes. So if you've got a history class and a psych class and a math class, switching between those, so doing your 45-minute session of studying, then switching to another, then switching to another, tends to be better. And I know that can be hard. A lot of us want to like get this assignment done, but it can actually help with your memory and with your cognitive attention to shift to the other topic for the next study session. All right, use other retrieval cues like context, so studying in the same place, take the test in the same place. Do your best to be comfortable and calm. Obviously, you will be engaged and you'll have some of those stress hormones as you're trying to do something that's important to you. And then the next couple slides are some of these same things, just that I've gotten from other books. So other books that talk about memory. This one was from I think this was from a general psych class. Some of these things that we've already talked about, getting enough sleep, we've mentioned mnemonic devices. These are the ones from your actual textbook for the class I'm recording this from, and we've talked about a lot of these already. Elaborative rehearsal, that's like the essays, like write essays for yourself, elaborate on concepts, make it connected to other things. Exercise helps, so having your body physically healthy, eating well as well. Yeah. So those are all things that can help you and your brain and memorizing and learning things. This is a good video that really goes over a lot of these topics. It doesn't dive into as depth for the neurobiology, but some of these memory strategies and the general of how it works. It's a good little review video. I won't watch it, but if you want to, feel free to go to it. Your book also has some connections to learning, associative learning, and conditioning. And with the time that we have in class, I don't think I'm actually going to go over this. If you want to learn more about this, it's basic behaviorism of conditioning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. A big difference between classical and operant is classical is it's just happening to you. You are not active, versus operant. You are getting a consequence from a behavior, whether it's a positive reinforcement or maybe it's a positive punishment, or a negative reinforcement or a negative punishment. Reinforcement makes things more likely to happen later on, and punishment makes things less likely to happen later on. So I won't actually go over these. So one of the main ideas here is keep your brain plastic. Keep learning new things, keep making those connections. Now that you know a lot more detail of the different brain areas and how your brain makes a memory, you can use that to your advantage, whether it's in school, with hobbies that you're interested in, trying to learn people's names, whatever it might be. Keep your brain plastic, keep it engaged, and you will have these cognitive capacities over your entire lifespan. So that is all for chapter 8. Double check the schedule for what chapter you are going to next.